When you're just starting out with .NET Core, or in fact with .NET or any of the related frameworks or libraries or technologies, the place to go is Microsoft's coolest domain yet, .net. So if you go to that site, it has everything that you need to know about .NET and ASP.NET Core, including downloading the SDKs and various tools, including Visual Studio, and getting access to the documentation. Again, for the full .NET framework, as well as Xamarin and .NET Core and so forth. And in particular, if you're interested in the documentation for ASP.NET Core, you can go directly to docs.asp.net. And that has a wealth of information, a number of tutorials, all kinds of information that you can use in order to get a good start in developing web applications. And in particular, you probably want to see some specialized topics like working with data for Entity Framework 6, Entity Framework Core, and Azure Storage. So this gives you access to data access technologies as well. Now, one big thing to be careful of here is you want to watch out for warnings on pages that haven't been updated for the release version 1.0.0 at least. Those pages, if they've not been updated, are going to have outdated information. And if there's any reference to DNX or DNVM, those are a couple acronyms. They're tools that were part of the early releases of the .NET Core before Microsoft pivoted and revamped everything. Any references there mean that the articles are old, so you want to stay away from those kinds of articles. You won't find many of those on docs.asp.net or .net, but particularly blog posts and things like that. All right, let's take a look at some of the resources that are available for getting you started with .NET Core. So I'm going to go up here to .net. And as you can see, that URL redirects to www.microsoft.com/net. And right away, you can start to see just how bold Microsoft's vision is for all of the .NET group of technologies. Any developer, any app, any platform. All right, and then there's various sections on this homepage that you can get information for Windows development. If you're interested in the .NET framework, you can download Visual Studio 2005 or download just the .NET framework itself. But if you're interested in .NET Core, you're interested in this section here, Cross-Platform Server Apps, and you can download .NET Core or learn more about it. And for the time being, Xamarin is a separate thing over here. So if you're interested in Xamarin and mobile devices, then you can download and get information about that there. And if you continue to come down here, you see that there's various kinds of information about what .NET is, an easy little toy tool for playing with some coding tool, some code, and then some marketing speak and so forth and ways to get involved in the .NET community. All right, so pretty good start. There's a lot of things here that you probably want to explore. But let's go right into the download .NET Core 1.0. And as you can see, you can download it for Windows, Linux, Mac, and they even have a Docker container that you can implement .NET Core in. All right, so Windows is selected by default, and as you can see, there's some basic information about installing .NET Core on Windows. And Microsoft is certainly interested in your using Visual Studio, but that's not necessary whatsoever. But I do want to point out that you don't have to purchase Visual Studio. The Visual Studio Community Edition is completely free. You can build some pretty powerful applications using the Community Edition. But then you can also download just the .NET Core SDK and various other components. There's a lot of different ways to get it installed on Windows. And then the rest of the page is basically just showing how you can create a new application. I'm actually going to be going through that in some detail. And keep in mind too that there's Visual Studio Code, which is not a full integrated development environment, but it's a very credible, more than just a text editor. If you do use that, you do want to install the C# extension from OmniSharp. So that gives you a lot of IntelliSense and color coding of syntax and so forth. All right, so it's super easy to download and get started with .NET Core on Windows. If you're working on Linux, you do have to select the flavor of Linux. So let's look at Ubuntu. Okay, so you need to do a few things here, a few command line operations there, and then you can install the .NET Core. And once you've installed it, then you can do those same sorts of things that I showed you on the Windows page. Because once you have the SDK installed, all the command line tools are the exact same. So it's really pretty cool. All right, Mac is fairly similar. This is what has gotten simpler in the last few months, and Microsoft will probably continue making that easier as well. All right, and then you install it, and you can see it has all the instructions, all the same kind of information. And then there's information for Docker as well. Now, if you want to go to the Downloads page, this is a fairly complex page that gives you access to pretty much all of the different .NET frameworks, all the different .NET libraries and so forth. So there's a section for the full .NET framework and then the .NET Core downloads, depending on your platform and what exactly it is that you want to download. And there's various release notes that you'll want to check out. All right, as the item says here, if you're interested in living on the cutting edge, downloading and using daily builds, you can do that using the GitHub repositories. And there are links that tell you how to do that and where to go for that. And then there's various tools. I think all of these I've mentioned: Visual Studio Community, Visual Studio Code, and there's also a Xamarin Studio. Okay, so we'll go back over here, and we can look at some of the other resources that are available. So one of the things that you'll want to explore is the Learn tab here. So this gives information about pretty much everything that you need to know in order to get started. It's all fairly basic kind of stuff, such as getting started with C#, exploring different languages and so forth, exploring the different platforms. So if you're interested in the .NET Framework versus .NET Core versus Xamarin, you can get access to different kinds of information there, as well as a lot of tutorials. But what's really most interesting is the Documentation tab. So this is the root repository starting point for all of the documentation for anything that you want to do with .NET. All right, so there's another link to getting .NET Core. But here's a couple links where you can get started with .NET Core. So this is the main documentation for the .NET Core framework, which is the underpinnings of everything that I'm talking about in this course. And as you can see, there's a lot of information about getting started and prerequisites and the tools and porting from the .NET Framework and migrating from DNX. That's sort of interesting that they still have that link, because DNX was that before it was called .NET Core, there were tools. There was a tool called DNX that you could use, essentially command line tools, and those have now gone away. But if you have an older application that you use some of the pre-alpha builds of .NET Core, then they have some information about migrating it over. All right, and so as you can see, there's lots of stuff here that you can explore. You can go through this days and days and days and days. All right, so I'll go back, and here's the Get Started with ASP.NET Core. So this takes us to an entirely different site, which has long been the ASP.NET home site. There's all kinds of information. If you go to www.asp.net, there's a wealth of information for building applications with ASP.NET, starting from version 1.0. And it includes a set of forums that are very active, well moderated, as well as lots of tutorials and so forth. But here's the ASP.NET Core documentation. So this is the main place when you start building web applications where you're going to want to go to get an introduction, getting started, release notes, finding tutorials, learning how to do various things. There's a ton of information here about all aspects of ASP.NET Core. And what's interesting is that Microsoft set this up as essentially open source documentation. So if you're interested in contributing to the documentation, there's an article that's missing or an article that just isn't clear, you can download the tools and contribute towards the documentation. it almost seems like a real open source project. It's really kind of amazing. And you have the link to more information right there down there in Read the Docs. Okay, so a lot of information here, a lot to explore. Some of it is fairly basic and will get you going. There is a lot of fairly esoteric kind of stuff too. So if you're reading an article and it's just not making it sense, you probably just don't have enough of the background pieces yet to understand that particular article. Normally there's going to be lots of links in most of the articles, so you can go back through and get lots of information that lays the foundation for understanding a particular topic. Now, do pay attention to the notes, and particularly the ones that say attention like this. So ASP.NET 5 was the original name. When Microsoft first started working on what became .NET Core and ASP.NET Core, they were calling the web development technology ASP.NET 5. I am so grateful that they dropped that name and that versioning number. The reason is because ASP.NET Core is such a radical departure from classic ASP. You do things differently. There are a lot of similarities. It's based on MVC. There's no web forms in ASP.NET Core, so those are left behind. But how you build the applications, how you implement middleware, how you hoist up a web server application behind the scenes is completely different. The controllers that you write, the views that you write are going to look pretty familiar if you've done classic ASP.NET MVC development. But there is a lot different. So to call it version 5, which implies that it's an evolution of what came before rather than the complete break and starting over, the revolutionary change, it really would have been a disservice. And a lot of people were scratching their heads trying to figure out how you even migrate applications, because there is no clear migration path from classic ASP.NET to ASP.NET Core. And that was going to be a problem. Okay, so they renamed it, and they call attention to that. Also take note of this here, that the documentation is definitely a work in progress. And there's still, even months and months after the release of these tools, of the framework, there's still a lot of placeholder topics here. They're working on it, but I guess they just need more people to contribute. But anyway, keep that in mind. That said, for the most part, what's here is very useful kind of information. Now, another thing to watch out for is, let's say I go down here into MVC, and I happen to know one example of this, which is view components. Notice that view components is not marked with that little, I think it's a socket wrench, as near as I can tell, or some kind of wrench, that indicates that it's a placeholder. That kind of implies that this is a completed topic. But when you go to that topic, notice the warning here that this page documents version 1.0.0-RC1 and has not yet been updated for version 1.0.0. Now, that may seem like, oh, well, how different can it be? You know, it just may seem like, well, there can't be that big a change, right? Well, after Microsoft released what they were calling Release Candidate 1, which implies that the features are locked, they're mostly implemented, there's probably some bugs. They haven't thoroughly eradicated the bugs. That's typically what historically a release candidate has been. No, not in this case. It was after RC1 that Microsoft did its last major pivot, and it was a big one. So view components is one of the things that changed radically within ASP.NET Core, going from RC1 to RC2, and then into the final release of 1.0.0. And we've had some minor updates since then. Okay, so pay attention to those kinds of warnings. Right now, it'd be a waste of your time to read this view components article. Actually, it would be a bit better if they were to just get rid of it and just put in a placeholder. But be that as it may, it is what it is. Okay, so as you can see, there's lots of information that Microsoft makes available, and there's even more on the GitHub repositories. It drives down in a little bit deeper there, but you can also file bugs and participate in the ongoing discussion and development of these tools. And I strongly urge you to do that. That's one of the beauties of open source communities, is that you can contribute and make a difference, and you can even try to influence things to go in a direction that you think makes the most sense for the tools and technologies. So definitely consider jumping in and getting involved. Now I want to give you a quick rundown on the components of .NET Core, what all the different pieces are that you're going to be encountering. So .NET Core consists of several key parts. The first is a .NET runtime, which provides a type system, assembly loading, garbage collecting, native interop, and other basic sort of services. If you've been using the .NET framework, this is similar to the CLR. And then another component is the framework libraries, or a set of framework libraries, which provide primitive data types and app composition types and fundamental utilities. And then there are a set of SDK tools and language compilers that enable basic development features. And these are available in the .NET Core SDK. And Roslyn, the .NET Platform Compiler, is what's key here. And then there's a .NET application host, which is used to launch .NET Core applications. It selects the runtime and hosts the runtime, and provides an assembly loading policy as well as launching the application. The same host is also used to launch SDK tools in much the same way. All right, so I'm going to be showing you each of these in action shortly. It's really important to understand that by itself, .NET Core includes a single application model, console applications, which is useful for tools, local services, and text-based games. And then additional application models are being built on top of .NET Core to extend its functionality. And ASP.NET Core is the first one that has been implemented, and I'll be showing you that as well. But soon we'll be seeing others, including Xamarin Forms. So one of the most wonderful things about .NET Core is that it's open source, and it's under a couple of the licenses. The most relevant one is the MIT license. If anyone has any doubts that Microsoft, at least the developer division, has fully embraced open source, these are pretty permanently put to rest. Now, Microsoft contributed .NET Core to the .NET Foundation by Microsoft in 2014. It's now one of the most active .NET Foundation projects. You can freely adapt it, including for personal, academic, or commercial purposes. And Microsoft claims that many companies use .NET Core as part of apps, tools, new platforms, and hosting services. Some of these companies make significant contributions to .NET Core on GitHub and provide guidance on the product direction as part of the .NET Foundation Technical Steering Group. The bottom line is that .NET Core has the makings of being a very robust, community-supported platform for really many years to come.